Permanent residence means you have a right to live and work freely in Sweden during the stated period. It also means that you're entitled to, for example, student loans and grants from CSN. You can also apply for Swedish citizenship. Previously, you could apply for a permanent residence permit as soon as you had been resident for 4 years with a permit that qualifies as the basis of a permanent residence permit, regardless of the In April 2019, the Swedish Migration Agency issued a new interpretation of the regulations and now states that applications should only be submitted no more than 14 days. Several people who had applied earlier have had their applications rejected. SULF anticipates that this will lead to problems as anyone who lives in Sweden during the gap between two residence permits will not be allowed to re-enter the country. This makes it difficult for people to attend conferences or to take other trips abroad. If you fulfill the criteria for long-term residence status, however, you can submit an application for a long-term residence permit instead. This can be done during the time you have a valid fixed-term residence permit. In this way, you can have your residence permit converted to a permanent residence permit. Please note that you are still entitled to stay and work in Sweden during the waiting period. From 20 July 2021, every person applying for a permanent residence permit needs to fulfill the criteria. As a result, it is no longer automatic that you will be granted a permanent residence permit if a family member has one. Therefore, it is a good idea to apply for a permanent residence permit individually if you meet the requirements. If you have been granted a permanent residence permit after being a doctoral candidate for 4 years, your family can also apply for permanent residence. From 20 July 2021, however, family members are no longer automatically granted permanent permit if you are granted a permit. Each family member must meet the requirements for that, and they must also be entitled to a continued residence permit. The requirements are that they are able to support themselves. This requirement does not apply to children under the age of 18, that they have had a residence permit for at least 3 years and have shown good conduct. If your family members do not fulfill the self-support requirement for permanent residence, they can instead be granted a temporary residence permit if you are able to support them. In these cases, the maintenance requirement is different than in the case of a permanent residence permit, as unemployment benefits and forms of support can also be included. If you are a citizen of a non-EU country and have lived in Sweden for 5 years without interruption, you can be granted status as a long-term resident in Sweden. This is not the same as a permanent residence permit, but if you are granted long-term residence status, you are also legally entitled to a permanent residence permit, so no further investigation. Long-term residency also confers greater rights to work, study, or start your own business in most other EU countries. If you have long-term residence status, you can stay outside Sweden if you remain within the EU and in the countries covered for up to 6 years. These countries are Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Latvia. In the event of a more permanent move to one of these countries, you can also transfer your long-term resident status there. To obtain status as a permanent resident of Sweden, you must have resided in Sweden for at least 5 years without interruption, which means staying outside Sweden for less than 6 consecutive months and not more than 10 months in total during the 5-year period is not considered interruption of the stay. A qualification period is calculated until the date of the decision. You must have had a residence permit or have legally resided in Sweden on other grounds for the previous 5 years, which means a residence permit for visiting or for studies other than doctoral studies may not be included, and you must be able to support yourself and your dependents financially. Please note that this financial support requirement is not the same as that which applies for the granting of a permanent residence permit. An application for long-term residence status can be submitted before your time-limited residence permit expires. If such an application is granted, you can have your residence permit changed to a permanent residence permit, even if you have a valid temporary residence permit at the time the decision is made. This means that you can apply as soon as you believe that you fulfill the requirements for long-term residence status. If you do not already have a permanent residence permit, the Swedish Migration Agency will consider your application as an application for a permanent residence permit as well. You do not need to submit two separate applications. The most important thing is that you apply before your current residence permit expires. If you have long-term residence status, you can stay outside Sweden if you stay within the EU and in the countries covered for up to 6 years. These countries are Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Latvia. In the event of a more permanent move to one of these countries, you can also transfer your long-term residence status there. Applying for long-term residence status can therefore be an alternative way of obtaining a permanent residence permit if you have lived in Sweden for 5 years, but for some reason do not meet the requirements for being. From July 2021, every person applying for a permanent residence permit needs to fulfill the criteria. As a result, it is no longer automatic that you will be granted a permanent residence permit if a family member has one. Therefore, it is a good idea to apply for a permanent residence permit individually if you meet the requirements.